And now our host, Stephen Lee Morris.
For our theatre communities, the pandemic, which has shuttered all live performance spaces since March of 2020, isn't enough of a burden. When live performances eventually return, our theatres will have to deal with the repercussions of Assembly Bill 5, which went into effect January the 1st, 2020. The bill, written by Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez, was intended as labor-friendly legislation targeting gig employers from multi-million-dollar for-profit corporations such as Uber and Lyft. The bill's edict is, with some exceptions, to eliminate contractors from the workforce and remake their status as employees, entitling them to minimum wage and healthcare and retirement benefits, and requiring the employers to subsidize those benefits with anywhere from 30% to 70% increases in their annual budgets. But the broadly written legislation also applies to nonprofit companies, such as theaters, most of which in Los Angeles County operate from venues of 35 to 99 seats. Among their functions is to launch the careers of actors, writers, and directors. These are theaters that have always operated on the edge of bankruptcy, and that even an added 30% to their annual budgets can force them out of business. In September of 2020, Governor Gavin Newsom signed a new law, Assembly Bill 2257, which exempts many workers from AB 5. Among those exempted include still and video photographers and editors, freelance writers, content contributors, editors, translators, fine artists, and musicians, but not actors or directors or designers who work in our theaters. Meanwhile, in the election of November 2020, Proposition 22 passed with 58% of the vote. This proposition, sponsored by the gig industries, created exemptions from AB 5 for the drivers of Uber and Lyft, the very people it was designed to protect from their uber wealthy employers. For local theaters, this has largely been a non-issue while they've been shuttered during the pandemic. But when they reopen, they must face the real-life impacts of AB 5 if an exemption hasn't been created for nonprofit companies in general or theaters in particular. Vanessa Stewart is an actress and an activist who currently serves as co-artistic director of the Sacred Fools Theater Company in Hollywood. She joins us on Animal Farm to discuss her advocacy for some kind of exemption for theaters or a complete reversal of AB 5. This is the first of 2 Animal Farm episodes dedicated to AB 5. Next week, Animal Farm is joined by Sacramento-based labor attorney Brian Hawkins, who has extensive experience with AB 5. Vanessa Stewart, welcome to Animal Farm.
Thanks.
So you have been working as an activist trying to undo the perceived damage of AB 5. From your perspective, where do you agree with the principles of the legislation and where do you diverge?
Well, you know, I think we all agree that the intent of AB 5, of course, was very good. You know, it was largely written to protect gig workers in multi-million-dollar companies like Uber and Lyft from being taken advantage of, you know. So, of course,
that worked out well.
As it turns out, not at all. But the intent of it was that, and, you know, anybody who cares about workers and benefits and all of that, of course, easily gets behind this law. But it was so broadly written that a lot of the little guys were affected and remain affected because turns out the multi-million-dollar corporations like Uber and Lyft were able to write a carve-out legislation for themselves and get it passed because they had all the money in the world to get voters to vote for it because they could advertise. Anyway, that was, of course, Prop 22.
Right.
And Uber and Lyft are exempt, and that's already starting to affect their workers. So,
What do you mean? How is it starting to affect their workers?
so for instance, Albertsons and Vons just this week laid off all of their full-time union drivers who got full benefits. They laid them all off so that DoorDash could take over that. And so, all of the gig workers for DoorDash are taking over union jobs. That's not what we want.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Now, this AB5, it applied to for-profit and nonprofit companies. It was an across-the-board state regulation that essentially, for most part, with some carve-outs, but for the most part, eliminated the role of a contractor and made everyone employees. Am I misstating that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the idea of independent contractors kind of goes out the window unless you meet this the Dynamex ABC test, which very specifically and narrowly defines what an independent contractor can do for a business. So, for instance, if your business is theater and you hire a plumber who doesn't work in theater to be an independent contractor and come in and fix your plumbing, that's okay. But if you're a theater whose business is theater and you want to hire an actor, designer, director to work on a gig that lasts from 1 week to 10 weeks, then you have to be, you are a wage employee now.
Which sounds superficially like a really good thing, but what's the but?
Okay, so the problem is that which has been the problem ever since the dawn of time for theater. For smaller theaters, I'm saying that for the theaters in Los Angeles, I know for most theaters that would increase the budget to go from an independent contractor or a fee-based contract so substantially. It would increase budgets by 75% for most of us, that it would put us entirely out of work. It would close theaters. It would or increase the amount of shows that a theater could do in a year. So instead of doing 4 to 5 shows in a season, it might be 1 to 2 shows a season with a 2-person cast. It's very similar to the argument that we had 5 years ago, only this time it doesn't just affect 99-seat theaters in Los Angeles. It affects all of California, union and non-union theaters alike, in budgets of,
So a law that was intended to slap down a multi-million company such as Uber and Lyft is now being applied to the Victory Theater Center and the Skylight Theater and other nonprofits where the profit margin is negligible, often in the negative.
Oh yeah, it's razor thin. I mean, nobody is in theater to make a profit.
Right. So what has been, before we get to what you're doing, have you heard anything about enforcement? I know a lot of the theaters were saying, we simply can't take this kind of budget hit. We can't increase our budget by 30, 50, 70%, whatever is applicable. So we're just going to pretend it isn't there. And that's dangerous. That was even 2 years ago, people said this is a dangerous strategy. Is it really dangerous, or what's the enforcement been like by EDD? Have you heard anything about that?
Well, the thing is that when this went into law was around the same time that the pandemic was happening. And so all of the theaters pretty much are kind of closed right now. So I don't even think actors realize the impact of what will happen if this is still the law when we come back online. Yeah. But, the people it affected musicians right away, of course, and with their gigs. And so musicians, they all went to their union and they got a carve out like almost immediately. Actors, I don't think it's occurred to them yet how it's going to affect them. But the companies around town are starting to talk about what they're going to do. And they're sort of forced to either go to this 1 show a season model or close or become entirely all volunteer.
Could you back up? What is this 1 show a season model you're talking about?
Oh, it's just some of the theaters we've been talking to, in order for them to be able to afford to make that jump, they would have to reduce the amount of shows they do in a season.
One a year. Yeah.
One a year, one a season. Yeah. And so, so a lot of the companies have been talking about going entirely all volunteer across the board. It's the only thing they can do, which, oddly reduces what, companies were able to pay actors and designers, and they wouldn't be able to work with like a lot of designers who we'd work with, like, and a lot of directors are already in unions that are like, well, the minimum is you have to pay them this contractual fee of $2,500, to start. That was usually about the fee for a lot of designers in smaller intimate theater. So we wouldn't be able to use those designers anymore. We wouldn't be able to use directors anymore. And most theater companies wouldn't be able to use actors anymore. So
would the theaters be allowed to charge box office, to charge ticket prices if it's all volunteer? Are they still legally allowed to?
Yeah, they haven't really taken that as a consideration. It's just it would be all volunteer, as like a museum or something. And so it's a little untenable, and it's not something that theaters want to do. We want to be able to grow, which it seems like the antithesis of what we were fighting with the union about 5 years ago, because like our dream is to be able to pay our actors incrementally more and more until we get to the place where we can be a bigger theater. But it's the ironic thing to me is that when AB5 was coming down the pipe and union leadership realized like, oh, all right, well, a lot of theaters are going to have to convert to what we've always wanted, this minimum wage contract, and they realized that the deficit was in arts funding, not in that we don't want to pay actors, not in like no theater except for Broadway's ever made the money with ticket sales.
Right.
They realized that we had a deficit in California. They came to California, to Sacramento, to lobby to get money so that we could make this transition. This was in January of last year. And then the pandemic happened and all arts funding for 2020 went away. So we found ourselves with this sort of double existential crisis of facing great loss by having to shut down for at least a year with the pandemic, on top of the limitations of AB5, which would increase. So they're wanting us to increase our costs for everything, for our facilities, for our staff, for every single person that walks in the budget and works on a theatrical piece. At the same time, there is no money in the kitty for anyone to have. So the tone deafness of them trying to like keep this law going.
You're talking about them being.
Oh, sorry. Now I'm talking about Sacramento.
Oh, Sacramento. Okay.
Well, Sacramento, and also Actors Equity, that would still endorse AB5, even when the musicians union got a carve out. The tone deafness of them pushing for this law to remain when arts all over the state is dying is insane to me.
Yeah. So the musicians union pushed for the carve out.
Yes, AFM.
The actors union is doing it precisely the opposite.
Well, let me specify about what AFM did. So their workers rose up, rightfully so, and that they're like, we can't survive unless we have a carve out. Now, because AB5 is supported by AFL-CIO, it's hard for the leadership of any union to say we fully support the carve out of a carve out in AB5. So AFM didn't lobby for a carve out. Their workers did, but AFM, the leadership at AFM stood down. They got out of the way. And ultimately their workers were able to get a carve out, which, is insane to me and wonderful, because it sets a precedent that possibly we could also have. But it's so contradictory because, let's say the musicians in AFM, they go to play a wonderful night of jazz. They're playing like Cole Porter. They're playing, those same musicians could not go to a theater and play like A Night of Kiss Me Kate, those same songs,
Yeah.
because now they're considered doing theater, they're actors in a theatrical production.
Yeah.
And there's so many holes like this in AB5 that it seems reasonable to me that they could use the same parameters, because they put a cap for the musicians on, they can't play a venue that sells more than 18,000 seats. They can't play a venue that's more than 1,500 people.
It's pretty
Okay.
reasonable. That's pretty reasonable.
Reasonable. So I don't understand why we can't also have the same kind of cap on a carve out.
All right. So the musicians agitated, and as you put it, they got their union to stand down.
Yes.
It is probably, from what I've been hearing and from what you've been implying, it's unlikely that Actors Equity Association is going to stand down on this issue. Possible, but unlikely. Which means, what can you do about it? What are you doing collectively about it?
So collectively, and I haven't given up completely on Actors Equity. It is, I know the leadership, it is a national union. So I would say the leadership is mostly in New York, and they don't quite understand our system of theaters, how we work, the fact that we don't have arts funding, all this stuff. But there are some counselors that are on the West Coast that understand what we're going through, that do advocate for us from within the union. I think something that's both very important to the union and very important just right now to society and in government is this recognizing, let's say, of BIPOC artists needing a voice, needing a home, needing a venue to start to grow their art. And my co-artistic director at Sacred Fools, Mark Antonio Pritchett, is working on some statements, some impact statements, some testimonials that we're going to, from BIPOC artists, talking about how important it is for them to have that bottom rung on their career ladder in which to grow their art, to move forward, to tell their stories, because it remains very seldom that these bigger theaters that can afford these sort of wage contracts for them to hire unknown artists and new voices.
Mm-hmm.
So we all got to start somewhere, and these bottom rung sorts of opportunities are about to go away. So he's sort of creating like this thing to appeal to Sacramento, to appeal to Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez, to appeal to those of us that are a part of Actors Equity that are seeking change, so it's we have sort of a multi-pronged approach of how to fight this, but that's one.
And nor is Actors Equity a monolith, from what you're saying, in terms of having one point of view on this. There's nuances within the organization itself, so there is at least the possibility for change. So it sounds like you are going to state legislatures to advocate for a carve-out.
That's right. So we have been working with a couple of advocates that do know some of the legislatures in Sacramento. We are crafting some legislation that we can present to lawmakers in California and Sacramento that either would help us with a carve out for theaters and actors and designers and directors, or maybe even help, give the bill an off ramp to overthrow it altogether, to repeal it.
Mm-hmm. Based on the idea that it was misguided.
Exactly. And based on the idea that, like, now that 22 has happened, and like the very reason why the bill was created in the first place it's not happening anymore, And so the only people that are still affected by it are just kind of the little guys at the bottom. And I don't think it's a good look for legislators to have affected an entire arts community in this way.
Do you have a sense of how persuasive that argument is in Sacramento, or is it too soon to tell? Do you have, what's your level of confidence that you can get beyond your one or two advocates within the state assembly? Well,
there are some conversations, going on with all sorts of legislators. I can't talk about specific conversations, but there's a feeling that a mistake has been made. We need a way out of it. and so we're trying to find, like I said, multi-pronged ways for them to gently get off this bill and start over. Not saying it's a bad idea, not saying that the intent was bad, but we need to rethink. And I know that like the AFL-CIO is very much behind this bill, as are many Democrats that I voted for. Like Elizabeth Warren was very behind AB 5. Biden's behind AB 5, but I don't think they got the nuance of exactly how it affected the smaller communities. And so even actors in our community, like I said before, don't realize what is coming, at the end of this pandemic and how this is going to affect everybody. So I think it's one part education. I did start a grassroots campaign online called Theater Artists Against AB 5. There's a Facebook group, and we're trying to use it for education so that people know how it affects other theaters outside of Los Angeles also, so they can get on board. And we can all, once we have this campaign, we're hoping to all start letting our assembly people know and just start kind of bothering them more and more, because this will start to come to the floor again in about May. So we're starting to roll that ball down the hill.
What do you see as a timeline for a possible vote on some kind of turnaround, either carve out for theaters or for nonprofits in general, or to reverse the law itself?
So the timeline is hopefully getting the new legislation written and in front of people March, April, to be signed by Newsom in May.
Great. Well, good luck on on pursuing the light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you. I'm hopeful. I remain ever optimistic. I've been Sisyphus rolling this ball up the hill. I can't let small theater die.
Vanessa Stewart, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Next week, we're joined by Sacramento-based labor attorney Brian Hawkins, who will discuss his work from a legal perspective on AB 5.
Voilà, ça c'était le matin, il me réveille.